You're watching Adult Studies on BBC Learning.
I was exceedingly fair, and my long hair was of a very light flaxen tint, so that I was generally spoken of among the Welsh-speaking country people as the Little Saxon.
He was one of the most original scientists of the 19th century, Alfred Russel Wallace. In 1858, while working alone in the Far East, Wallace independently hit on the theory for which Charles Darwin would receive most of the credit: evolution by natural selection. He was a novice compared to Darwin, and from a less privileged social class. The origins of his scientific work have been neglected for almost a century. Now, historians are getting to the root of his famous discovery. Today, the theory of natural selection is the central premise of the life sciences. But Wallace's discovery was no flash of solitary genius, no bolt from the blue. His insight was made possible by his early work here in Wales, as a surveyor, a field naturalist, and an amateur anthropologist. The land and the people of Wales made an indelible impact on Wallace. In later years, he wrote detailed accounts of his experiences.
He had a very impressionable mind. He was open to all sorts of suggestions. He accepted all sorts of what his fellow scientists thought were very peculiar ideas, and certainly non-scientific ones. And probably lots of these started during his stay in Wales. His interest in land nationalisation was probably prompted by the fact that he was forced to make measurements for the Land Enclosure Act. His interest in spiritualism later, possibly because he studied the occult beliefs of the Welsh population. His later interest in racial characteristics, probably because he was aware of the fact that there were two distinct communities existing in Wales.
Wallace was born in 1823 near Usk, in the parish of Llanbadog on the Welsh borders. His large and humble family lived at Kensington Cottage.
Our house was less than a quarter of a mile from the old bridge of 3 arches over the River Usk, by which we reached the town. The walk there was a very pleasant one, with the clear, swift-flowing river on one side, and the narrow fields and wooded steep bank on the other. There was a very beautiful view up the river valley of the mountains near Abergavenny, 10 miles off. The conical sugarloaf in the centre, the flat-topped mass of the Blorenge on the left, and the rocky ridge of the Skirrid to the right. These names were so constantly mentioned that they became quite familiar to me as the beginning of the unknown land of Wales. Another vivid memory of these early years consists of occasional visits to Usk Castle. Some friends of our family lived in the house to which the ruins of the castle were attached, and we children were occasionally invited to tea, when a chief part of our entertainment was to ascend the old keep by the spiral stair. While on the inner, we looked down to the bottom of the tower, which descended below the ground level into an excavation said to have been the dungeon. The top of the walls was about 3 feet thick, and it was thus quite safe to walk round close to the parapet, though there was no protection on the inner edge but the few herbs and bushes that grew upon it.
When Wallace was young, his family moved to England, where he received his only formal education. He left school at 14 and joined his brother to train as a land surveyor. It was a boom time for the trade. Commons were being enclosed and tithes recalculated. Landlords hired surveyors to measure the exact area of their property. The basic techniques are still in use today.
You need to pick a series of straight lines close to the hedges. You pick those straight lines so that they form triangles, and you can solve triangles very simply. So the way that this field might be surveyed to work out the area would be initially to position the points 1, 2, 3 and 4 so that you can form a series of triangles.
And you'd mark it with one of these poles?
Yes, that's what each of these points numbered on the diagram. You would have a point marked with a pole like this so that you can see it from end to end. And you may want to mark the point on the ground.
How do you measure the length of each side then? What do you use?
Well, that would have been done with a chain made up of links, and each chain was the old measurement of one chain long, 66 feet.
So you would say one side of the field was one chain and so many lengths long?
Yes, or the number of times that you lay the chain down between, let's say, points 1 and 2. At every 10 links along the chain, you find a small tag like that.
Right, just makes counting easier.
That's it. And that 4 represents 40 links from the end. So we don't have to count 1, 2, 3,
We've got 41.
These wonderfully accurate measurements and calculations impressed me greatly, and with my practical work at surveying and learning the use of that beautiful little instrument, the pocket sextant, opened my mind to the uses and practical applications of mathematics, of which at school I had been taught nothing whatever.
So the sextant has a pinhole that you can look through. You can see straight towards a distant target, which may be one of the poles that we're measuring from. And this button on the top rotates a mirror that's inside so that two images of two different points appear to merge so that one is immediately above the other.
Much the same as Mr. Wallace used in his day.
Exactly.
I think you would like land surveying, about half indoors and half outdoors work. It is delightful on a fine summer's day to be cutting all over the country, following the chain and admiring the beauties of nature.
In 1839, Wallace moved to the Welsh borders with his brother's surveying business. At New Radnor, he corrected the parish map, and at Llanbister, where the brothers explored the ruins of Abbey Cumhir. 10 miles south, they surveyed for the enclosure of common land at Llandrindod Wells. Then they wandered wherever there was work. They found themselves in the Welsh-speaking heartland. Wallace lodged with the locals and began learning the language. Chapels were the cornerstone of this culture, and though he was a skeptic, Wallace admired the vitality of religious services.
Dyna'r gair dilyn esiampl, fel medde'r hen gyfeithiad, fel y canlynech I olef.
I went sometimes to chapel in order to hear the Welsh sermons and also the Welsh Bible well read. And I was greatly struck with the grand sound of the language and the eloquence and earnestness of the preachers.
A grym I atgyfodiad a chymdeithas I ddioddefiadau.
The Welsh clergy are usually good readers and energetic preachers, and seem to enjoy doing full justice to their rich and expressive language.
Ac yn cwblhau yn fy nghnhawd yr hyn sydd yn ôl o gystuddiau Crist, mwyn I gorff.
And even without being able to follow their meaning, it is a pleasure to listen to them.
I fod yn barod I gario'r groes a'i chyfrin goron am ei croes fy mhrio Duw.
In late 1841, the Wallace brothers crossed the Brecon Beacons to Merthyr Tydfil. They pushed on into Glamorganshire as far as Neath. Their job was to survey the nearby parish of Cadoxton, and they lodged at Bryn Coch farmhouse with the bailiff of the Dufferin estate. Wallace climbed into the hills with chain and sextant, measuring and mapping. For the first time, he found simmering unrest. At farm after farm, he saw hardship and heard bitter complaints.
The farmers are almost invariably yearly tenants. Consequently, little improvement is made. The landlord likes to buy more land with his spare capital rather than improve these miserable farms, and the tenant is too poor to lay out money. In his farmyard, we find the buildings with broken and gaping doors and the floors of the roughest pitching. The hedges and gates are seldom in sufficiently good repair to keep out cattle, and can hardly be made to keep out mountain sheep.
Life on the hill farms of South Wales was a real struggle for existence. It was tremendously hard to grow anything. It was difficult to raise crops and to keep animals. Life really was a continuous struggle.
It became a social struggle. At mass meetings, farmers vented further grievances about the enclosures, the poor rates, the tithes. In 1842, the mood turned ugly as guerrilla groups roamed the hills. Landowners were threatened and toll houses attacked. The turnpike tolls were one tax too far. The hated toll gates had to go.
These poor farmers, these hill farmers, were literally up in arms, and they went about their work in a rather strange and obscure sort of way. They attacked at night, they dressed up as women, they wore wigs and skirts and petticoats. And the leader of each group of rioters was always called Rebecca. The book of Genesis has a reference to the biblical character Rebecca endorsing, really, people who pull down toll gates. The actual Rebecca rioters were, for the most part, small farmers, small tenant farmers, the sort of men who would have to pay the tolls in going through the gates and have to pay very, very heavy tolls for the passage of animals, wagons, and lime. These were the very men who had to pay the tithes too. So it's small wonder that they were the leading lights of Rebecca.
Tithe assessment was a surveyor's job, working hand in glove with the landlord. It was the bottom line in Rebecca's protest.
I think a young man, as Wallace was, surveying in South Wales, must have had a difficult battle with his conscience to be surveying for tithes, because he could see the abject poverty of the people.
The poor Welshman works hard and lives poorly. He bears misfortune and injury long before he complains. The late Rebecca disturbances, however, show that he may be roused. It is to be hoped that he will not have again to resort to such outrages as the only way to compel his rulers to do him justice.
With work at a standstill, Wallace's interest turned more and more to natural history. He set out to learn botany, and in late 1843, he became a stalwart among the local self-improvers. A few years later, he even designed and built them a permanent home, the Neath Mechanics' Institute.
These cropped up during the 1830s and the 1840s to a very great extent in Mid and South Wales. And Wallace was, of course, instrumental in developing the one in Mid Wales, in Kington, where he first lived and worked, and then later when he moved down here to the Neath area.
Mechanics' institutions are societies which have of late years been established in many towns in the kingdom for the purpose of applying the principle of combination in affording scientific instruction to all persons, and especially to the working classes.
They were mainly evening lectures, and they were mainly didactic or instructional from the point of view that because of the deficiencies of the education system at the time, they were aimed at increasing the knowledge of, working people to a very great extent. Most of these mechanics institutions had very good libraries. The Neath one had an excellent library of about 4,000 books, which was remarkable for that time and period for a very small town in South Wales. Equally so, the king of all the institutions locally, as it were, the Royal Institution at Swansea, also had a very good library. So between the two, Wallace had access to almost any book on natural history, zoology, botany, and so on. that he wished to get hold of.
This was the centre of science in South Wales, high science. Just 6 miles from Neath, Wallace could mix with mine owners, magistrates and MPs. Some were members of the Swansea Turnpike Trust, which set the local tolls. But to Wallace, the top attractions were lectures and the library. Science books were beyond his means. He did splash out once on Lindley's Botany for 10 shillings and 6pence, but it rather frightened me, he said. Like the hill farmers, he confessed to being always very short of cash.
During the summers that I and my brother lived at Neath, we spent a good deal of our leisure time in wandering about this beautiful district. I know Wales pretty well, but I cannot call to mind a single valley that in the same extent of country comprises so much beautiful and picturesque scenery and so many interesting special features as the Vale of Neath. But the most remarkable and interesting of the natural phenomena of the upper valley is Porth yr Ogof, the gateway of the cavern where the river Mellde runs for 1/4 of a mile underground. The entrance is under a fine arch of limestone rock overhung with trees. But the valley just below has wooded banks, open glades, and fantastic rocks near the cave, forming one of the most charmingly picturesque spots imaginable. Caves abound in all limestone regions owing to the dissolving power of rainwater, penetrating the fissures of the rock with outlets often at a distance of many miles, gushing forth in a copious spring. I wanted once to try sleeping out of doors with no shelter or bed, with what nature provided, as if I'd come accidentally to the place in an unknown country and had been compelled to sleep there. But very little sleep was to be had, and while in health, I've never passed a more uncomfortable night. What occupied me chiefly, and became more and more the solace and delight of my lonely rambles among the moors and mountains, was my first introduction to the variety and beauty and the mystery of nature, as manifested in the vegetable kingdom. On Sundays, I would stroll in the fields and woods, learning the various parts and organs of any flowers. I took the volume of Loudon's Encyclopedia and set to work with increased ardour to make out all the species of plants I could find. Starting after an early breakfast, we walked to Pont Nedd Vychan and then turned up the western branch to the Rocking Stone, a large boulder of millstone grit resting on a nearly level surface. It was here I obtained one of the most beautiful British beetles, Trichius fasciatus. The only time I ever captured it. Within a 4-mile walk of Pont Nedd Vychan, there are 6 or 8 picturesque waterfalls or cascades. One of the most interesting, named Ysgwyd Gladys, being a miniature of Niagara, inasmuch as it falls over an overhanging rock, so that it is easy to walk across behind it.
Wallace moved to the parish of Llantwit to wind up the surveying business after his brother's sudden death. The cottage was big enough for his mother and sister to join him. Beyond the parish church, they had a fine view across the Vale of Neath to the Drumai mountain. Rebecca had been banished from these hills, but she left a bitter harvest. The land belonged to the great Knoll estate. Wallace was to complete a survey for the new tithe valuation. His original map survives, bearing his signature. The fields form an intricate mosaic showing individual habitats, each one a niche in which a tenant farmer eked out his living. The tithe schedule also exists, written in Wallace's hand. When the survey was finished, he was sent around to collect the cash for payment to the Anglican rector.
This was a disagreeable business, as many of the farmers were very poor. Some could not speak English and could not be made to understand what it was all about. Others positively refused to pay. This made me more than ever disposed to give it all up if I could but get anything else to do.
Other habitats, other species still fascinated him. Local lectures were a constant stimulus, and by now Wallace had devoured the evolutionary bestseller, Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. It was all the rage at the Swansea Royal Institution, where he attended soirees with his sister. In 1848, he decided to change his life, transform himself, evolve. He swapped chain and sextant for gun and net. He would collect natural history specimens for a living, not tithes. Months later, he set off for the tropics, a self-employed evolutionist in search of a theory. Although he would travel far and win fame, Alfred Russel Wallace never forgot the native people of Wales. In after years, he still upheld their aspirations.
The Welsh are a distinct nation with a peculiar language, literature and history. And the claim which they are now making for home rule, along with the other great subdivisions of the British Islands, is thoroughly justified.
This land equipped Wallace with the basic skills and insights he would need for a career in science. Here he learned how to make maps, collect specimens, lecture, and write essays. More important, in Wales, Wallace first studied the customs and language of a non-English people. He witnessed it firsthand, their struggle for existence, a struggle not only with nature itself, but with the landowners and the lawmakers who ran the rural economy. 10 years later, on the far side of the world, Wallace would remember this struggle and see how it brought about the evolution of new life.
You're watching BBC Learning, and here's what's still to come in adult studies. This is BBC Learning, and just before